Marxism comprises many principles, but in the final analysis, they can all be brought back to a single sentence. It is right to rebel against reactionaries. Hello, 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 my comrades. 大家好，同志们. Welcome back to the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution podcast with your humble host, Drew Smith. 新年快乐! Hope everyone out there had a blessed and bountiful spring festival or Chinese New Year. Had a pretty good one myself here in Xi'an. Spent it almost entirely with the partner. Her dad presented us with quite an impressive spread of Hunan and Jiangxi cuisine. Because they are from Jiangxi province. So Jiangxi food is very similar, almost identical to Hunan cuisine. And it's very spicy, very yummy. We really didn't go out much because the crowds in Xi'an, and according to the news, a lot of other cities like Beijing, Changsha, and certain tourist attractions like Disneyland, Shanghai were so huge that we were like, not risking some kind of Travis Scott Astro World sort of situation. You know what I mean, guys? Yeah, it was bad. Just watching the live stream on the Xi'an official tourism channel or seeing our friends' snapshot moments in WeChat had my partner and I sweating with anxiety. Like, we looked at that, we were like, if anything were to go wrong in that crowd, someone would die. Thankfully, there were no stampedes or crowd crushes here in Xi'an or any other part of China. So kudos to, the crowd control, because that looked scary. But now we're in the home stretch of winter break. Honestly, I'm starting to get bored. I'm ready to get back into the teaching saddle with my awesome students. They're cool. They're cool cats, let me tell you that. Very great, bright young minds. So let's cut the jibba jabba and the personal oversharing, y'all, because tonight we are talking about my absolute favorite part of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, the January Storm of 1967, and we are going to be covering the first part of the power seizures of January through March of 67. Now, today we're just going to cover the January Storm, but then next month we'll be doing part 2, where we'll be having a roundtable discussion with some surprise guests about the Shanghai Commune and the Harbin and Beijing communes and the spread of the power seizures outward into the provinces. Okay, so let's start with a basic definition of what a power seizure is in the context of the Cultural Revolution. As you guys have heard in this podcast, we've talked a lot about the Red Guards and rebel workers taking part in rallies, uprisings, strikes, riots, occupations, struggle sessions, looting, a diversity of tactics. Things that were meant to shake up and chase off the rightist capitalist roaders in the party, but weren't really meant to replace it with anything permanent. I get the feeling that a lot of the rebels just had faith that Chairman Mao and the Central Cultural Revolution group would just take care of that part. I'm not really sure, but maybe that's just the feeling that I get. Or, there was a lot of spontaneity and idealism that was still a problem in the Red Guard movement. Although I think we can all agree on that part. By the end of December, though, things had completely changed since the balmy and brutal days of Red August. Most local and provincial party committees were barely functioning due to infighting between rebel cadres and right-wing cadres. The police and militia had strict orders to not interfere with any rebellion except in extreme cases, and the army was essentially paralyzed for about a month. And this is particularly important, Rightist groups like the United Action Red Guards in Beijing and the Scarlet Guards in Shanghai and Nanjing were counterattacking at an alarming rate. So, the Cultural Revolution was truly at a crossroads. It could either A, stagnate into repeatedly destroying the old world, or B, it could regain momentum and build the new world, or what Lenin called the new power. If you guys remember, he called the Soviets, the workers, peasants, and soldiers Soviets in Russia, the new power. And my friends, the rebels in Shanghai did just that. And if you think the May 16th circular opened Pandora's box, well, wait till you see what the January storm brings. Before I tell the tale, let me tell you guys how tonight's podcast is going to be structured. I'm going to be less linear in my telling, and I'm going to instead present you guys with 4 case studies: Shanghai, Beijing, Nanjing, and Xi'an. Shanghai because obviously it was the first, largest, and most sweeping of the power seizures. Beijing because the power seizure there was carried out in a more decentralized manner with less of a consolidated rebel headquarters. Nanjing because it shows sometimes the power seizures were not as they seemed. And Xi'an to show what the power seizures looked like in the more westward provincial capitals. So let's dive in, and we'll start with Shanghai. When I left you guys last month, the Shanghai Rebel Workers HQ had routed the Scarlet Guards in the Battle of Kanping Road and then arrested 240 leaders and activists of the Scarlet Guards who had attempted to travel to Beijing to plead their case with Chairman Mao. Mayor Cao Duqiu, party chief Chen Pishan, and the Shanghai Party Committee refused to budge, though, and continued with only making piecemeal material concessions like higher wages and luxury goods to the workers. Like, at one point, Chen Pishan offered to have the remaining Scarlet Guards go around town and distribute free bicycles to every working-class household in the city. And he'd offer things like, Peking roast duck dinners at every workplace after each shift. And, the workers of Shanghai were like, "Ooh, whoopee, hey, guys, guess what? We're owed hundreds of yuan in back pay, and the plant managers have essentially privatized key sectors of the industry in the city. Why don't you do something about that?" And so it was at this point something in Shanghai had to give, and whoo, boy, howdy did it give. On January 1st, 1967, the party organs People's Daily and Red Flag jointly released an editorial called "Carry the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution to the End," which proclaimed, 1967 will be a year of all-around development of class struggle throughout China. It will be a year in which the proletariat, united with other sectors of the revolutionary masses, will launch a general attack on the handful of persons within the party who are in authority and are taking the capitalist road, and on the ghosts and monsters in society. It will be a year of even more penetrating criticism and repudiation of the bourgeois reactionary line and elimination of its influence. However, guys, note that this did not necessarily say anything about seizing power, only that the class struggle was going to escalate and sharpen. It kind of left things open to interpretation. How the Shanghai Rebel Workers HQ interpreted it, however, was exactly what would set the tone for the rest of the year of 67. With Shanghai's economy nearing collapse due to economic sabotage by the remnants of the Scarlet Guards and by the Municipal Economic Planning Committee withholding wages from those uppity rebel workers, the first 3 days of 67 were filled with meetings by Red Guard groups in various cells of the Workers' HQ. Struggle sessions, rallies, sit-ins, and occupations were not going to put food back on the table or pay the electricity bill. So a congress was held of all the rebel groups in Shanghai, calling it Grasp Revolution and Promote Production, Save Socialist Shanghai. There, a new statement was drafted called Take Firm Hold of the Revolution, Promote Production, and Utterly Smash the New Counterattack Launched by the Bourgeois Reactionary Line. A message to all the Shanghai people, or which we will call for short, Message to the Shanghai People. Which, well, it was exactly what it sounds like. A declaration for the people of Shanghai to rise up against the wind of economism and capitalist restoration. But there was a problem, a very, very big problem. None of the major newspapers, which were still in the hands of the capitalist roaders in the Shanghai Party Committee, would print the statement. Hoo boy, big mistake on the rightist part. This was a big, big, big mistake. Now, there were two main newspapers in Shanghai, Liberation Daily, which I've mentioned before, and Wenhui Daily. Liberation Daily's office had been subject to attacks by Red Guards a month or so prior for refusing to take part in the rebellion. But the initial attack on their offices didn't really stick. Wenhui Daily had an interesting dynamic where the editorial staff and party staff in the offices were pro-Shanghai Party Committee, but the press workers, reporters, and journalists in the rank and file were mostly pro-rebel. On January 4th, 1967, the rank-and-file staff of Wenhui Daily seized control of the newspaper and established it as a propaganda organ of the Red Guards and the Rebel Workers' HQ. Later that same day, not knowing what had happened at Wenhui Daily, Zhang Chongchao and his homie Yao Wenyan returned to Shanghai. The rebels called up Zhang and Yao and told them to meet them as soon as possible so as to bring them up to speed with what had been going on the past few days. Zhang and Yao were totally on board with the rebels seizing power at Wenhui Daily and publishing their statement, but reminded the rebels to emphasize the Grasp Revolution part of Grasp Revolution Promote Production, and to not just make this a matter of the rightists were ruining the city's economy. This was, after all, about the fate of socialism in China itself. Before dawn, on January 5th, 1967, the morning edition of Wenhui Daily released the rebel statement, the message to the people of Shanghai that had been denied by the press prior. The people of Shanghai took the message to heart and took to the streets. The January storm had begun. The Rebel Workers HQ and a joint command of all Red Guard groups in Shanghai held a joint rally of hundreds of thousands of people in People's Square and said that the Shanghai Party Committee no longer held power in the city and that it was time for the people to take control of the class struggle. The next day, January 6, Liberation Daily was subject to a similar power seizure and issued a statement calling for the seizure of power away from Cao and Chen. At a second mass meeting of 100,000 people in People's Square, Cao Chen and the Municipal Politburo were brought before a jeering crowd and forced to self-criticize, and the leadership of the Rebel Workers HQ declared that the people of Shanghai had dismissed them from their posts. The PLA garrison in Shanghai sent a telegram to the Workers HQ offices and told them that They wholeheartedly supported the power seizure, and in turn, Yao Wenyan telegraphed Mao about the seizure of power at Wenhei and Liberation dailies, as well as the mass struggle session in People's Square that had resulted in the complete toppling of the Shanghai Party Committee. Mao was beaming with joy. "The situation is excellent," he proclaimed with great enthusiasm. He was surprised at the independent initiative of the people of Shanghai and proud of how they had taken the Cultural Revolution into their own hands. When some comrades in Beijing expressed concern about the possible power vacuum in Shanghai, Mao brushed it aside, saying, "In making revolution these days, people demand this or that. When we made revolution from 1921 onwards, we set up the first Youth League and then the Communist Party. We had no funds, no printing press, no bicycles. When we ran newspapers, we were very friendly with the workers and chatted with them as we edited articles. We must speak of grasping revolution and promoting production. We must not make revolution in isolation from production. The conservative factions do not grasp production. This is a class struggle. You must not believe that, quote, when Chang the butcher is dead, we'll have to eat pork bristles, hair and all, or that we can do nothing without them. Don't believe that sort of rubbish." For those who don't know, the proverb that Mao said about Chang the butcher is an old Chinese metaphor about the need for harmony and authority. The idea that if the village butcher dies, the townsfolk will have to eat the pig whole, including the inedible nasty bits. Still, Mao called for some reasonable moderation. A new city governing body should be convened out of the rebel congresses as soon as possible, he said. And he said that they should unite with as many cadres as possible. He reminded the rebels that not all cadres holding revisionist positions were inherently bad people or were firmly in the camp of the capitalist roaders, but most were in fact simply misguided comrades who needed to be re-educated through comradely line struggle. Rehabilitate as much of the Shanghai Party as possible, he recommended, and then you can set up a new proletarian headquarters. Even before the new city government and party committee were set up, though, the people of Shanghai were feeling the positive effects. The rebels seized power at all the banks in Shanghai and unfreezed all the back pay and the wages that the local rightist workplace managers had skimmed off. So people finally had money to spend. The fourth day of the January storm was essentially like Black Friday after Thanksgiving. Every department store and supermarket were packed to the gills with people ready to shop until they dropped. And people were walking around in sharp new clothes and riding on fresh-looking new bikes and scooters. Shanghai felt like Shanghai again. The most prosperous and cosmopolitan city in China was alive with people spending and celebrating. The power seizure continued with the rail bureau of the city being seized on January 9th, in case the remnants of the Shanghai Party Committee or the few remaining Scarlet Guards that hadn't defected to the rebel workers' HQ got any bright ideas. They also seized the docks and wharfs of the city, and since Shanghai was, and still is, the busiest port in all of China, that put one of the most important pieces of the entire nation's economy back into the hands of the revolutionary left. The People's Daily issued an urgent notice congratulating the people of Shanghai for their work in advancing the Cultural Revolution to a new level, showing that the party center was now in support of the January storm. Mao sent a message to the rebels in Shanghai saying that all of China should emulate their power seizure, and that it was the most correct action taken so far yet in the new revolutionary movement. On January 12th, at a mass rally celebrating Mao's endorsement of the January storm, Zhang Chengchao began to wrangle for position as head of the new city government and gave the keynote speech lauding the great victory of the Cultural Revolution in Shanghai. By the middle of the month, however, a new government had still not been quite put in place. Granted, in fairness, it had only been about 2 weeks since the first assault on Wenhui daily offices started the January storm. And so you saw this point in Shanghai where it was essentially like Petrograd in the months between the February and October revolutions in Russia. So, much like how in Russia there was a dual power of the provisional government and the workers' Soviets, in Shanghai there was a dual power between the Red Guard and Rebel Worker Coalition and the Shanghai Party Committee, which were still nominally around. Because, you see, Chen and Cao had not formally resigned, although they were no longer in charge of day-to-day affairs, and their memberships in the party had been indefinitely suspended. So, the Cultural Revolution, as we've well established so far in this podcast, was going to be messy, and it was going to continue to be a bit messy in many respects. On January 19th, worker leader Wang Hongwen met with a Congress of Red Guard groups and asked for their opinions on how to cobble together a new city government. There, the Rebel Workers HQ leadership and the Red Guards gave the government a new and very interesting name, the Shanghai Commune. They felt it was time to sharpen the class struggle deeper and more democratically, and that the people of China were ready to resurrect the Paris Commune of 1871. Word began to spread quickly that a new city government staffed by rebels and built in the style of the Paris Commune was happening. On the 24th, a convoy of PLA trucks, tanks, and APCs paraded through Shanghai, brandishing little red books and red flags, shouting the glories of the, quote, January Revolution as a new era for China. Now, there were still some problems. One faction of the Red Guards, the Revolutionary Rebel Committee Red Guards of Fudun University, ended up being very unhappy that Zhong Chengchao was going to be in charge of the new city government and tried to start an uprising. However, the CCRG declared that any rebels opposing Zhang taking over as party chief of the city were in the wrong and called on the other Red Guards to crush the Fudun University Red Guards. Afterwards, Zhang Chengchao conferred with the rest of the rebel apparatus in the city and agreed. In 1 week's time, they would declare the creation of the Shanghai People's Commune. But I'm actually going to leave you guys on a cliffhanger there, and next month I will be telling the tale of the Shanghai Commune during our roundtable discussion called Seize Power Part 2, Shanghai and Other Communes, with my guests. Let's now take a look about what was going on in Beijing. Beijing is unusual compared to the other urban centers during the January storm of 67. This is particularly because, well, it was the capital. So that's always going to color things in a different manner. Beijing was also unusual in that the rebels were not consolidated into a single rebel coalition like the rebels in Shanghai. And the Red Guard movement in Beijing was still very much student centers, with the workers and soldiers only playing a supporting role. This made it a very scattered and decentralized power seizure. In fact, scholar Andrew G. Walder argues there was no power seizure in Beijing during the January storm, and says that the status quo in Beijing didn't really change until the establishment of the Beijing Revolutionary Committee in April. Personally, I highly disagree with him in saying that there absolutely was no power seizure in Beijing, but I do get why some scholars come to that conclusion, because indeed it was very decentralized. The Beijing Commune didn't really get off the ground, And the Revolutionary Committee there was established several months after the Shanghai Revolutionary Committee. In fact, some rural provinces had their revolutionary provincial committees established before the Beijing one. So, let me try to tell you guys, as briefly as possible, how the rebels in Beijing seized power. On January 4th, Liu Jian, a top PLA commander in Beijing, was forced to resign from the army due to his wish to maintain law and order and use the army to rein in the factionalism of the Beijing Red Guards. Jiang Qing gathered a conference of military, academic, and cultural workers and told them that Liu followed the bourgeois reactionary line and was going to stifle rebellion in Beijing. He was then replaced with Guanfeng, a particularly hardline leftist aligned with Kang Sheng. That same day, the protests against Politburo member Tao Zhu kept growing around Shanghai, and it wasn't until Zhou Enlai stepped out to speak to the rebels that they were placated, and an attempted breach of the compound was stopped. That didn't stop the Beijing Red Guards, however, from wanting to topple the top rightists on a national level right then and there. On January 6, Jinggangshan Qinhua Red Guards, Kuai Dufu's faction, kidnapped Liu Pingping, the daughter of Liu Shaoqi and Wang Guangmei. They whisked her away to Beijing No. 1 People's Hospital and forced her to call her mother and lie, saying she had been in a car accident. The idea was to have Wang Guangmei come to the hospital, where the Red Guards would kidnap her as well and then hold her and Ping hostage until Liu Shaoqi resigned from power. However, when Liu himself came with Wang, the Red Guards hesitated, wondering if it was the right time to physically attack Liu. They gave Zhou Enlai a ring on the phone and asked what he thought about the matter. He said it would be inadvisable and told them to let the Liu family go back home. Still, the fact that the Jinggangshan Qinhua Red Guards had been able to lure the Lius into a trap emboldened them greatly, and they declared a quote-unquote victory against Liu Shaoqi that day. On January 8th, while basking in the glow of the power seizures in Shanghai, Mao made a provocative statement about the recent protests about Tao Zhu. It doesn't matter if Tao Zhu controls several ministries. You don't need ministries to make revolution. Let the Red Guards take over the ministries. Ruh-roh. That was big talk from the big guy. At Beijing's Xinhua bookstore, rebels seized power and pulled out all posters of and books by Liu and Deng and burned them at a rally in Tiananmen Square. Some of the workplace and campus power seizures began to take place, but still things seemed pretty disorganized in Beijing. No seizure of city or national liberations by the Beijing Red Guards. Yet. Quote, yet. January 13th was an interesting day because on that day, the Central Cultural Revolution group called for all police and army to, quote, protect the left. And statements like these, protect the left, support the left, and eventually arm the left, were continually issued to the police and army across 67, often with escalating results. We'll have quite a long time about the Arm the Left campaign of 1967 as it unfolds in later months, however, on a later episode of this podcast. On January 14th, the first national-level ministries experienced their own power seizures. The Light Industry Ministry was seized by rebel cadres within it, along with Red Guards from the Light Industry Institutes. Rebels then seized the Petroleum Ministry. Soon the ministries began to just fall like dominoes. Next came the Forestry Ministry, then the United Front Headquarters, then Red Flag and People's Daily editorial offices, the metallurgy industry, the chemical engineering industry, the machinery industry. Key economic ministries just kept being swiped up more and more by the Red Guards. On January 18th, a day before the Shanghai rebels began to label their upcoming city government as the Shanghai Commune, Nia Wanzi, you guys remember her, the one who wrote the first big character poster at Beijing University? Well, she actually met with rebel workers and Red Guards and suggested a power seizure of the Beijing Party Committee and establishing a Beijing Commune. So yeah, the Beijing Commune was talked about a day before the Shanghai Commune. And a Beijing Commune working group was established, but it never declared itself to be the new municipal government of Beijing. January 19th, the day after, is where things start to get a bit crazy with Beijing and shows you just how fractured things were in the city. The Geology Institute's East is Red Guards took over the textiles ministry, but ended up getting into a fight with the Jingangshang Red Guards, who were attempting their own power seizure at the same time. That same day, a coalition of rebel teachers and professors seized power from the Beijing Party Committee, only to have a rebel worker faction seize power from them, and then a student Red Guard faction seize power from them. No, I am not joking. There were 3 power seizures in less than 24 hours, toppling the Beijing Party Committee. Then the Geology East is Red Guards teamed up with the Aeronautics Red Guards to seize the Ministry of Culture. Then Nia Wanzi and her Beida Red Guards seized the Ministry of Education. The Ministry of Labor got swept up by the Economics Institute Red Guards. The Ministry of Commerce got hit by a 2-sided attack by the Red Rebel Regiment Red Guards and the Red Rebel Army Red Guards. Meanwhile, the Public Security Ministry moved in and arrested the entire leadership of the United Action Red Guards, effectively decapitating the largest anti-CCRG Red Guard group in Beijing, which would be important for the left to continue any power seizures. By the 22nd of the month, nearly every government ministry was in the hands of the Red Guards, and the central government was firmly in control by the left. One key thing that also happened during the final week of January in Beijing was that the Red Guards used the power seizures to shut down all the mass organizations in China that had been essentially moribund since the summer of '66, but still were technically functioning at their central offices. So the Communist Youth League, the Young Pioneers, the All China Federation of Trade Unions, All China Women's Federation, the China Peasants Association, and all the United Front parties like the Revolutionary Committee of the Kuomintang and the China Democratic League, China Democratic Workers' Peasants Party, yada, 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 those were all declared dissolved. So basically, essentially, the United Front was gone. They would be replaced, respectively, by the Youth League was now completely replaced by the Red Guard factions. The All China Federation of Trade Unions was now the Revolutionary Workers' Congress. The Young Pioneers were now the Little Red Guards. The All China Women's Federation was replaced by Revolutionary Women's Committees. The China Peasants Association was replaced with the Revolutionary Peasants Representative Committees. And these new mass organizations, I really like them because they were actually built on popular participation and direct democratic supervision of the masses, making them a refreshing new start for non-party members in China who had felt stifled by the respective United Front mass organizations' leadership. Anyways, while the Beijing power seizure had not nearly been as decisive as the Shanghai power seizure, it essentially toppled the national level bureaucracy for the time being and was a sign of things to come in other parts of China. The People's Daily said that the avalanche of power seizures around China were to be a great leap forward and the call of an all-around people's class war. The editorial ended with a provocative call. Form a great alliance and seize power! Seize power! Seize power! Okay, so let me put a bookmark there in the Beijing story, and now let's turn to Exhibit C. And this is an interesting case that shows that the power seizures weren't always what they seem. In fact, sadly, some power seizures could be hardly classified as power seizures at all. What do I mean by that? Well, folks, we need to talk about Nanjing. Nanjing was a show that the power seizures weren't always these heroic crusades by the proletariat to destroy the capitalist roaders. Indeed, it was a sign that sometimes power seizures were just shams in which the powers that be would declare themselves rebel cadres and seize power from themselves, back to themselves, in order to preemptively save their own skins. The power seizures hit 23 other provincial capitals, with only Tianjin, Hohhot, Fuzhou, and Changsha not experiencing Shanghai-like power seizures. And it's an unfortunate fact that this wave of revolutionary struggle would be an uneven one, in which there would be, well, infiltration by the capitalist roaders. Nanjing, the capital of Jiangsu province and the former capital of the Republic of China, had attempted power seizures on January 26, after which they sent delegates to Beijing to ask the CCRG to help them cobble together a new government. The problem is, Zhou Enlai and the CCRG were split as to which group of cadres should lead, and Mao himself did not personally weigh in on the matter. In the end, the Nanjing rebels turned on each other, and it took PLA intervention in March to suppress both sides and end the deadlock. And unfortunately, it developed into a reestablishment of the status quo well after March of '68, a year later, when they finally created a provincial revolutionary committee for Jiangsu. Now, much like many other municipal governments in China at the time, the Nanjing city government and party committee had essentially collapsed by December due to Red Guards toppling most of the city's top party brass. With such a power vacuum, the Scarlet Guards were able to form their own chapter in Nanjing and claim to be a rebel group trying to establish stability and order and carry out the Cultural Revolution. While the Nanjing Scarlet Guards were quickly defeated by January 3rd of '67, it caused the Nanjing Red Guards to be on edge and a bit suspicious of each other. On January 22nd, City Party Chief Jiang Guiqing declared that the Nanjing Party branch of the Communist Party of China had ceased to function. That week, a group called the Jiangsu Red Rebel HQ began issuing directives that were essentially echoing their Shanghai counterparts. Led by Wen Fenglai, a Nanjing University political science professor, the Jiangsu Red Rebel General HQ met with other rebel groups like the Nanjing Red Rebel Brigade and the 27th August Revolutionary Union to form the Jiangsu Revolutionary Rebel Alliance. Oddly, the Nanjing rebels hesitated to seize power and decided to wait until, of all people, Zhou Enlai urged them to do so. And Zhou was initially okay with this. Zhou was a centrist, yes, and he wasn't fond of the Jiangsu Revolutionary Rebel Alliance. But since Jiangsu was essentially without a functioning government across the entire province, not just Nanjing, and its economy had begun to collapse, so, Zhou thought something's better than nothing and told them to go ahead and seize power in alliance with the remnants of the Nanjing Municipal Party Committee and the local PLA garrison, deeming the remnants of the old party to be, quote, rebel cadres worth aligning with, albeit with seemingly little investigation on either Zhou's part or the rebels' part. Zhou contacted the Nanjing University 27th August Red Guards. I'm just going to call them the Nanda RGs for now. and he told them to submit a power seizure proposal to the CCRG immediately. The Nanda RGs CC'd their directive to Gao Xiaoping, a member of the Provincial Party Committee who had been consistently allied with the Red Guards since the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, as well as to the Nanjing Military Region HQ. However, there seemed to be a catch. One Nanda Red Guard leader, Zhen Bangyan, said that he had reservations as to whether or not the Red Guards could lead a new government. Zhou had a rather conservative solution. If that was the case, he said, the rebels could simply supervise incumbent officials who had, quote, self-criticized and promised to join the rebels. Ha 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 ha. Oh no. Still on January 23rd, Zhou phoned to General Lang Jiqing of the Nanjing Military Region and militantly told him it was time to lift the lid off of class struggle in Jiangsu. Across the next few days, unfortunately, the Power Seizure Committee stalled in negotiating how to build a post-seizure municipal government, with most Red Guards citing a, quote, lack of democracy and that the balance of power was far too in favor of, quote, rebel cadres, most of whom had not proven themselves to be truly rehabilitated, and PLA officers, rather than the Red Guards and the rebel workers. Due to this, Nanda's Red Guards walked out and declared they would not take part in a power seizure that would potentially reinstall the party leadership that had been toppled in December of '66. Nevertheless, the rest of the rebel groups in Nanjing just decided to go ahead with the power seizure. On January 25th through 26th, shortly after midnight, 10,000 Red Guards and 10,000 PLA troops worked together to capture all municipal and provincial government buildings. Due to the fact that Jiangsu essentially lacked a government, or even a party chapter for that matter, many participants felt that the power seizure was one big anticlimax and that it was nothing more than political theater. The anti-seizure rebels were furious when the victorious rebel faction, who they felt had played into the hands of phony rebel cadres, was preparing to draw up their declaration of victory at the Jiangsu Xinhua offices. The anti-seizure rebels stormed the press offices. Although Zhou's secretary was able to phone the offices, convince both sides to stand down and come to Beijing to discuss rebel unity. On February 7th, Zhou hosted a group of delegates from both factions. Yes, I said February. I know I'm going past our January mark here, but I don't know when I'll be able to return to Nanjing in the story, so just to be safe, I'm going to tell you guys the details here. So on February 7th, Zhou hosted a group of delegates from both factions. Needless to say, the meeting did not go well, with both factions realizing that Zhou was in charge, and they were going to have no real say in who would prevail. Across the next 2 weeks, the Nanjing rebels held various meetings with Zhou Enlai and Tan Zhenlin, trying to end the deadlock. It soon became clear that Zhou wanted to put Jiang Weiqing back up on the throne, although this time with him being labeled a rebel cadre. After all, Tan Zhenlin said, Jiang Weiqing had opposed Liu Shaoqi's market reforms in the early 60s. It was quite apparent now that the old guard would be back in power, much to the chagrin of the rebels in the PLA. But because these old guard good old boys had ostensibly self-criticized and had taken part in the January power seizure, there wasn't much of an argument anyone could make against them. Back in Nanjing, the anti-seizure rebels put up dazabaos declaring the power seizure to be a sham and that it did not reflect the will of the people. People who supported the power seizure responded with, whoever opposes January 26th is a counter-revolutionary who opposes the January storm. The anti-seizure group met with Jiang Qing and Kang Sheng on February 10th and found them to be far more receptive. Of course they would be. Upon hearing of the meeting, Zhou brought the anti-seizure rebels back to the negotiating table. Maybe we can work something out, he thought. After a day of back and forth, the dissidents decided to finally just accept the rehabilitation of Jiang Weiqing, seeming just to be ready to be done with the matter as long as it made the party center happy and got Zhou Enlai off their case. But you guys didn't think it would be that easy, did you? Because meanwhile, back in Nanjing itself, violence between the two sides broke out into bloodshed and eventually resulted in the PLA having to establish martial law in the city on March 5th and be the de facto government in Jiangsu until the establishment of the Jiangsu Revolutionary Committee a year later when... sigh. You guessed it. Jiang Weiqing became chairman of the Jiangsu Revolutionary Committee. Ain't that a pain to hear? Truly a serious bruh moment for Zhou Enlai. Honestly, I don't think there would have been a split in the rebel ranks if it hadn't been for Zhou. And they may have been able to keep the old guard in the province neutralized, but, hindsight's 20/20, as they say. All right. So, for our final example, Exhibit D. Okay, we're going to talk about a fun little story. This is the shortest one, but it's a great one because it's close to my heart. We're going to look at the power seizure here in Xi'an. Xi'an's power seizure is kind of neat because, well, first off, I live in Xi'an, as you guys have well know. And second of all, it's just an interesting look at what the smaller provincial capitals were like in their power seizures. So the Xi'an rebels were entirely based, well, not entirely, but almost entirely based around a student leadership. I mean, yeah, there was like a dozen rebel worker groups across town, but it was really the University Red Guards who stole the show here in Xi'an with the Shanxi January Storm. Before the January Storm, the Xi'an Red Guard movement had to cleanse its own ranks of the rightist anti-CCRG Red Guards in the city, who were extremely brutal and cruel in their method of struggle. Things that would make the Beijing High School Red Guards during Red August a bit queasy. The Xi'an Red Guard HQ, the Red Terror Squadron, the Workers and Peasants General Headquarters Red Guards, and the Cultural Revolution Liaison Station Red Guards were all forcibly dissolved for their refusal to want to effectively topple the Shanxi Provisional Government. Also, it was found out that the Red Terror Squadron and the Cultural Revolution Liaison Station were both networking with the Picket Corps and United Action Red Guards back in Beijing. And those two factions tended to come from upper class backgrounds. Not upper class like bourgeoisie, but I mean like they were the kids of the top party brass in Shanxi. So they were definitely bad news bears. On January 19th, all other Red Guards and rebel organizations in Xi'an came together to create the Unified Headquarters. The Unified HQ would essentially serve the same purpose as the Shanghai Rebel Workers HQ, and would be an embryonic organ for the establishment of the new power in Shanxi province. They sent in Red Guards into the streets, occupying the city center around the Bell Tower, Drum Tower, and Revolution Street, which is called Bamboo Market Street today, and declared the area liberated. On January 24th, 600,000 people gathered in the Shanxi Workers' Stadium to take part in a mass struggle session against First Secretary of the Northwest Bureau Lin Lantao, who was vocally loyal towards Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. Lin Lantao resigned that day, admitting to be a capitalist roader. Then came the morning of January 25th. The January 25th power seizure went as thus. The Xi'an Jiaotong University's Red Guards and Shanxi Normal University Red Guards moved in to capture the Shanxi Provincial Committee, the Shanxi Provincial People's Committee, the Shanxi Municipal Party Committee, and the Xi'an People's Committee. Red Guards of the Northwest Telecommunications Engineering Institute, Northwestern Polytechnical University, Northwest University, baby, Xi'an Mining Institute, and other institutions seized power from the Shanxi Provincial Public Security Ministry and the Xi'an Public Security Bureau. The Xi'an garrison of the PLA did not actively take part in the seizure of power, but instead decided to just stand back and let the Red Guards take the reins of power and refuse to help the provincial and municipal party committees when they radioed in for help in stopping the power seizure. The rebel workers seized their workplaces, and the rebel peasants seized their people's communes on the outskirts of the city. Unfortunately, just a few days later, on January 31st, the unified headquarters split, with the Jiaotong Red Guards feeling that they had not been properly consulted enough on the makeup of representation in the unified headquarters leadership, and thus Xi'an became split down the middle between the Jiaotong-led Workers' General HQ, or the East faction, and the Northwest University-led Workers' Alliance, the West faction. East Side and West Side proceeded to descend into factional fighting, and well, I'm actually going to stop there because factional fighting, yeah, it's going to be a big thing over the next few episodes. And I've talked to your folks' ear off already, haven't I, tonight? Sorry for being so chatty tonight, but the thing is, for me, the January storm and the power seizures are, in my opinion, the high tide of the great proletarian cultural revolution. I think it shows an amazing amount of independent creativity and initiative from the masses who really allowed the cultural revolution to be a vehicle for themselves. Now, I disagree vehemently with what Alain Badiou's idea that this was the true end of the Cultural Revolution, or that somehow the January Storm repudiated the need for a communist party after the seizure of state power. But I definitely feel he's kind of on to something. Like, there's an element of truth to it when he says that this was the climax of the Cultural Revolution. Well, in my opinion, there were multiple climaxes of the Cultural Revolution, but this one here, this one's my personal favorite to research. All right, y'all, well, I'm going to shut it down here. Man, what a fun topic. And next month, we're going to have Seize Power Part 2, Shanghai and Other Communes. We're having to do this in 2 parts because, man, this stuff is just getting started. And I haven't even began to cover the Shanghai Commune yet. So tune in next time for another exciting episode. Whoo, boy! The sources for today's episode include Proletarian Power, Shanghai and the Cultural Revolution by Elizabeth J. Perry and Li Shun. Agents of Disorder, Inside China's Cultural Revolution by Andrew G. Walder. The World Turned Upside Down, A History of the Cultural Revolution by Yang Jishang. The Paris Commune in Shanghai by Jiang Hongsheng. The Shanxi Provincial Archives. Beijing Municipal Archives Chronicles Online. Factional Conflict at Beijing University, 1966 to 1968 by Andrew G. Walder. Mao's Cultural Revolution in 1967, The Struggle to Seize Power by Philip Bridgham. Nanjing's Failed January Revolution of 67, The Inner Politics of a Provincial Power Seizure by Dong Guoqiang and Andrew G. Walder. The Policy of the Military Supporting the Left and the Spread of Factional Warfare in Shanxi's Countryside, 1967 to 1968 by Shinichi Takigawa, and Viewers Like You. All right, guys, well, there's no corrections corner tonight, so that's good. I've, been on top of my game lately. And so I think I am going to order myself some Beijing roast duck and call it a night. So until next time, 再见! It's right to rebel. Making revolution is not a crime.